Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. An Israeli friend of mine who is well known in Israel and outside of Israel as a leading strategic thinker had a discussion with my wife in the past 24 hours on the situation in the Middle East. And it said, in his opinion, from a standpoint of Israeli interests, that what is going on now would not be continued much longer in terms of Israeli aggression in the Middle East. Unless, he said, unless this is a strategic move by other sources which are now pushing for an immediate response to an impending general economic collapse of the world economic monetary system. In point of fact, the world economic financial system and much of the political system at the same time is presently in the process of collapse. And for that reason, because there's a correlation between what's going on in Southwest Asia, what's going on in India, what was going on in the context of the G8 summit in Petersburg, in Russia, we're on the verge of a condition tantamount to the guns of August of 1914 and 1939. Now, we're not looking at a war of the type that we would class as World War I or World War II. We're talking about something worse, not less dangerous. We're talking about the danger of a general disintegration of global civilization. And it all is tied together with the present economic situation. This being the case, and the facts to this effect having been presented to leading circles in the US Congress and elsewhere, the US Senate in particular, why has the Congress behaved like a bunch of braying asses? And being a braying ass does not qualify you as a Democrat. But they seem to have thought they were. But because they're baby boomers. Now, baby boomer is not exactly a generation. And I shall speak to you today as being very nigh on to 84 years of age, and therefore have a corresponding experience of life which is probably richer than most people of my age group, because I was active in certain ways as a youngster. I lived through the 1920s, through a generation of my parents and older people who were better called degenerates, because they were corrupt. This was the age of Coolidge and the age of Wilson. And our society was immensely corrupt. But when the time came, and when the Hoover administration had led the US economy down by 1/2 in physical condition over the period from 1929, the end of 29, to February, the end of February of 1933, we had a president who fortunately was not assassinated, though many of the Democratic Party leadership at that time wanted him assassinated and even planned to do it, but didn't succeed because an honest general and some other people, a Marine general, blew the whistle on it. And they couldn't pull off the coup d'etat to do a Nazi-style coup inside the United States. We are fortunate to have a President Roosevelt who led this nation to save the world from what otherwise would have been inevitably a Hitler dictatorship worldwide. A Hitler dictatorship conceived by leading banking interests, financial interests, which are the same interests behind Felix Rohatyn and similar forces in the world today. So you are facing today exactly the same evil that we faced in the form of Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and so forth. And we're facing it at the hands of the descendants of exactly the same circles of financiers in other circles which were behind Hitler then. Circles inside the United States, inside France, inside the Netherlands, inside Britain, as well as inside Spain, Italy, and inside Germany. The same thing, the same crowd, with the same ultimate objectives. Now, I lived through these experiences. I lived through the moment that Franklin Roosevelt died. And I came back to the United States from military service abroad in the spring of 1946. The country had changed. The passing of Roosevelt had meant a moral degeneration of our country. I saw my friends who had been heroes in warfare, who had been courageous, turned into stinking cowards under the Truman administration and what it represented. Because Truman was on the opposite side from Roosevelt and did everything he could to destroy the life's work of Franklin Roosevelt at the moment that Roosevelt died. But they couldn't get rid of one thing. The whole world was bankrupt, and only the United States, as Roosevelt had led it to recovery, was capable of providing the basis for a recovery of the world economy. And so until the middle of the 1960s, the Bretton Woods system and some of the other essential economic intentions for the domestic United States and abroad were carried through. So we had a period of recovery of much of the world over a period of 20 years, even after Roosevelt had died. And that continued until about the beginning of the war in Indochina, which was made possible by the assassination of a president of the United States, Kennedy, who was one of a series of targets of assassination and similar things, like President Charles de Gaulle of France was a target of assassination by the same forces, the Nazi forces, the same force exactly behind Felix Rohatyn in the United States and abroad today. So we had the Indochina War. It was a demoralization of our population to be in such a war. This is the worst kind of war to be involved in. Long wars. It has been called a Dark Age war. It was called Armageddon now, later. It had many of those characteristics as the kind of war you never fight if you can avoid it, unless it's forced on you. You never seek it out. You never try to fight it. You never declare it. You may declare against it, but you'll never declare it. Not if you're human, not if you're sane, not if you're moral. As you wouldn't have started this war in Iraq. If you'd been sane, you wouldn't have done it. If you'd been moral, you wouldn't have done it. There was never a reason. It was based on lies, and it's still based on lies by a president who's not called a criminal because he's insane. And I mean it. He is insane. He's a puppet, but a dangerous puppet, a malicious puppet. Right? We lived through this. I lived through these things before. What the object here, and I'll give you two lessons today, which I give in other locations, but I'll give them here in this context. One is a history lesson. The other, which is crucial, is an economics lesson. Something that no one in the Congress apparently seems to understand as the basic principles of economy. They don't. You would have to say that if they're innocent, it's because they're stupid when it comes to economics. Because what they're allowing, what they're doing is stupid. And I'll make that clear. All right, in the history of the thing, remember what we are. We saved the planet. We saved the planet from Hitler and what that meant. Oh, other people did it too, but without us, without our President Roosevelt, and without our support for that effort, you wouldn't have had the period of growth and peace and so forth that we had, relatively speaking, in recent times. We'd have been living under Nazism or its aftermath. What happened was, not only did Truman betray the United States And he betrayed the United States because we knew what the interest was of the United States at the time the war ended. We knew that. What did this bum do? This stinking bum. What did he do? Now, before the war had ended, the Emperor Hirohito of Japan had extended a negotiation to the United States and other nations for a peace treaty or an armistice. He had processed it through the diplomatic channels into the Foreign Office of the Vatican, the Secretary of State of the Vatican, and into the office of a special part of the Secretariat of State of the Vatican, which was the Extraordinary Affairs Group, then headed by a Monsignor Montini, who later became Pope Paul VI. The conditions for the surrender were arranged with the United States while Franklin Roosevelt lived. I had a friend of mine who was the head of OSS in Italy at that time, who was a personal observer of the details of that negotiation. This friend of mine was also a friend of General Donovan, the head of OSS. Both were attached to the Roosevelt tradition. So the facts are known. The facts of this case have been verified by the Vatican more recently to a member of that friend's family. What did Truman do? Japan was defeated. Its situation was hopeless. All that was left was the main island, and you couldn't get a ship in or out of the main island because the United States Air Force and Navy and Army had the thing so securely blockaded that Japan had to surrender. But now Truman became president. Why didn't the United States offer to honor the agreement of armistice with the Emperor of Japan, which would have ended the war? Because Truman said, no, we don't honor the agreement. And why didn't he? Because Truman, working with people in Britain and elsewhere, knowing that we had nuclear weapons, Truman didn't know about this until he became president. We had two prototype nuclear weapons, one a uranium bomb, one a plutonium bomb. These are laboratory devices, not production line devices. So we dropped one on Hiroshima, another on Nagasaki, which were civilian cities, civilian populations. Why? We had a defeated enemy, Japan, whose head of state was prepared to surrender. We postponed the surrender in order to bombard two Japan cities with nuclear bombs, the only two we had. We'd had a third one, but used as a prototype for testing in Los Alamos. Why do we do that? Because the Truman policy was directly opposite to Roosevelt's. Roosevelt's policy, as he said to Churchill during the war and said to others, when this war ends, Winston, we're not going to have your British system anymore on this planet. We're going to have the American system. And that means that those colonial nations are going to be freed. We're going to help them develop. He said that repeatedly. He said it in a visit to Morocco, where he laid out the details of the plan for Africa while he was there. What happened? Truman not only dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on a defeated enemy, unnecessarily. He saved not one American life by that effort. None. He would have saved American lives by giving the armistice terms, presenting them earlier, because attrition did kill some people. So therefore you stop a war as soon as you can, because simply keeping the war going will mean more people will die, even if you don't make any new attacks. What did Truman do? Well, Indochina had been liberated. By whom? Well, by people from the OSS and by Ho Chi Minh, who was a collaborator of the United States. What did we do? Well, the British requested and Truman allowed. We had Japanese prisoners of war in camps in Indochina. The orders were to release these people from the camps, give them back their weapons, and have them occupy Indochina all over again, which had been liberated by forces associated with the US OSS forces. We did the same kind of thing in Indonesia, which also had struggled for its liberation. The Dutch went in there with allies and butchered the resistance to recolonization. Recolonization was on the agenda. This was the Truman policy. So what happened? Well, as a result of this, Truman was committed to a policy crafted by Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was probably the most evil man of the 20th century. He was the one who devised a policy of using nuclear bombardment, preventive nuclear bombardment, as a way of causing the Soviet Union and other nations to give up national sovereignty, i.e. globalization, and to submit to world government. That was the Truman plan. Recolonize, loot, suppress, lie, kill, betray everything he dared to betray. That's what he did. We did something else. In this process, we formed a series of organizations, presumably to fight communism. Presumably. But what did they actually do? They targeted the section of the population born approximately between 1945 and 1967, 57. This section of the population that was targeted were people who were going into families whose children would probably go to universities and become the leaders of society, the upper crust of society, once they came into maturity. Not the whole generation, but the generation of the upper 20% of family income brackets, the future upper 20%, which became later known as the 68ers. The people who in 1968 massed on the streets and took their clothes off to demonstrate the sincerity and had all kinds of things they did, smoked everything, did everything, and so forth, and decided that people who worked for a living and blue collars, blue shirts, were no good, that farmers were no good, and scientists were no good, technology was no good, and scientific and technological progress were no good, and having to work was lousy. This is called the baby boomer. These people were called the golden generation, which I used to refer to as the golden degeneration, known for its brass. So what happened is we have a generation which is now between 50 and 67 years of age from this particular stratum or influenced by this stratum, which has created a culture called the golden generation culture or the baby boomer culture, or we don't fight. We kill, but we don't fight. We got a victim, we kill him. We don't fight. He's got a gun, we don't fight. So what we have done is, if you should look at the figures on what's happened sociologically to our country since the beginning of the middle of the Vietnam War, when the 68ers moved, we moved against infrastructure development on which our economy depends. 50% of a healthy economy depends upon basic economic infrastructure, power, water, so forth, municipal care, these kinds of things. 50%. Most of this investment is in the form of investments in facilities or institutions, which have a half-life of 25 years and a full life of 50 years or more. The kinds of things that are wearing out and breaking down and failing today in the United States, because we haven't repaired them. We haven't fixed them. or replaced them during the past 40-odd years. And it was the baby boomers that did it. They are the ones who came in with the Green Revolution, with Sunday. And that isn't a day of worship. That's a day of deviltry. Huh? So we have destroyed our economy deliberately. What we've done is we've destroyed the kind of economy and the kind of society, an egalitarian society, which we had and fought for under Franklin Roosevelt to get it back. After a lot of bum presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, who were Ku Klux Klan types. And they obviously are not egalitarians, are they? And people like Coolidge, and people like Hoover, who was not personally a bad guy, but he was an instrument of a bad policy, and he did rotten things accordingly. We were being destroyed. We got our country back. Under Roosevelt and a group of people around him who inspired our people who were being oppressed and miserated, and I saw it, and who had done something else. We were a stinking population still in the 30s, I can tell you. I was there. I was in schools, I was in the college and so forth, and I saw it. I was on the streets of New York in December 7th, 1941, a Sunday morning. And I was going over to a business appointment from the streets of New York to a hotel where this relevant meeting was occurring. I got there, was a strange mood in the hotel lobby. I couldn't understand it. And then I heard Pearl Harbor had been struck. Now, how did our people react? How did my generation react to that bombardment, to that news? You couldn't keep them from volunteering. There was no good news. There was no easy promise of victory. This was hell. But in fact, for the alliance of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, but for that alliance, you'd be living under Hitler or after Hitler period today. Those were the odds. We in the United States were the gut that saved humanity. And it was people of my generation reacting to 41 and to Roosevelt and to Franklin Roosevelt that mobilized and turned the world around and saved humanity from what would have been otherwise inevitable Nazi terror and occupation of the planet and whatever came after Hitler. And it's exactly that that's being betrayed, and it's exactly that which is the purpose. That betrayal was the purpose of the policies under which the baby boomer generation, which now dominates the Congress and dominates other leading institutions of society, is raised. And you find the fact of the matter that I have to deal with, and you have to deal with in life, you find that over the process, since these events, since the events of 1968 to 1971 and beyond, that people who used to work for a living and trade unionists or this or farmers and so forth, who had pride, over the course of that period of the 1970s began to lose their pride. They began to lose their sense that they were important people whose voice was important in shaping the policies of government. You saw a period in the 70s and into the 80s in which the typical person who was in a Democratic Party organization as the popular party began to drift away from parties. There's a separation of the political population. The majority of the population was separated from the idea that the government was theirs, that they owned the government. Not completely, but they had a voice in the government. It was what they said were their interests, which were their interests, or had to be heard as such. Now they don't believe that anymore. The problem we have in the population is the golden generation, so-called, generally 50 to 65 years of age, which runs most of the institutions as a group with their ideology, says we make policy. Look what's happening right now to this Senate that wouldn't do a damn thing for the country. They said, we want our riches. We're going for the upper class. What do you mean by the upper class? The upper 20% of family income brackets. We're orienting, we're going to the right wing. We don't want to hear about the lower 80% of the population. We want the lower 80% of the population to be grateful for the fact that we're there. But don't come up to us and ask us to do something for you. Don't ask us to listen to you. Don't ask us to remedy the evils that are done with your consent to us, to our communities. And that's the cultural change. That's what we're up against. Now, I'm not saying that these people are of the golden generation, so-called, or the brassy generation, are evil. I'm saying they're corrupted. They're sophists. They have the same kind of mental disease that Greece had in Athens, that led Athens under Pericles, which had been at that point the leading civilization of the Mediterranean region at that time, and led it into an act of murder on the island of Melos, a Nazi-like murder, which was the beginning of the total corruption of Greece, and led to the Peloponnesian War, which was the end of the hegemony of Greek civilization at that time. We in the United States, the Athens of America, we have allowed the generation, just the way it was done in ancient Greece, in Athens, before the Peloponnesian War, we allowed the young generation, the people being raised to become adults, to rise at the time of their maturity, when they reached about the age of 20 and so forth, to be the golden generation of Pericles, of the golden age of Pericles, which was the doom of Greece. And we created a golden generation among us, the baby boomer generation, the upper 20% of family income brackets that bought into this deal. And the way this was done was by a very evil organization, led formerly in the United States by Sidney Hook, a personal enemy of mine. The American Family Foundation, another evil institution. Large think tanks, influential institutions, evil institutions, the corruption of our universities, the corruption of our campuses, the destruction of competent education, the brainwashing of people in all categories of education is what was done to us. We have become the Athens of America, self-doomed, because of the golden generation. Now, the only way you're going to get this thing solved is in part through an upsurge of the masses of people who do not wait for permission for the voice of the lower 80% of our family income brackets to speak of their rights, to speak of their interests, to speak of the interests of their generation, the coming generation, their children, their grandchildren. And the second thing, we have to find among the golden generation people such as Bill Clinton and others who are decent human beings personally and have good intentions, though they have the taint and corruption of being part of their generation. We have to get them to treat their generation as a disease and set out to cure that disease instead of adapting to it. The tendency of the baby boomer is they will not share anything except their diseases, especially their mental diseases. And that's what they do. And we want Bill Clinton to reform and to become a prophet of what has to be done rather than what he wants to adapt to. I know that'll take a lot of guts on his part. I think he's got the guts to do it under the right circumstances and with the right kind of support from people immediately around him. But that's our problem. We can save the nation. We can save civilization. There's no guarantee that it will work, but it's the only shot we have. Just as in Pearl Harbor Day, 1941. It's the only shot we have. It's either fight that war or give up, and give up everything we live for, and give up the future of our people. We are going to fight because we have to fight, because we have no alternative but to fight. Not because we seek war, but because it has been forced upon us. A fight to save civilization. Now, as you know, most people aren't civilized. That's a problem. And this comes to economics. The basic problem, that's why I'm turning to economics here today, not just economics as a subject per se, but economics as a moral issue, an issue of personal morality, which most people lack. They don't know what personal morality is in terms of economics. They don't know what the difference is between man and an ape. That's the problem. Every species of animal has a general limitation on its population density. The limitation is relative. It's relative to the conditions under which the animal lives, or the animal species lives, but has a limit. Man is not. If man were a higher ape, our population on this planet would never have exceeded several million individuals at any one time. We now have over 6 billion. How did that happen? And the greatest part of this growth in population, the rate of growth and improvement in condition of life of the average human being on the planet, miserable as it is in some parts, has occurred since the beginning of the 15th century with the Golden Renaissance. And it began in Europe. So in European civilization, in the 15th century, there was the beginning of a change where the life expectancy and size of the population, the conquest of disease, the improvement of powers of man in production and so forth, and improvements in statecraft, in the organization of society, all began there. That is a significant stage. We now have over 6 billion people. And that involves some problems, some challenges we can meet. So that's not the problem. But we have 6 billion people. Why do we have 6 billion people? Because we're not apes. Much as many members of our Congress seem to believe they are. What's the difference in economics? And it's the issue which is central to my work in economics in particular. It's called creativity. Now, people use the word creativity loosely. I mean, if a guy learns how to unzip his fly, it's called creativity. This is not what I mean. If he can't unzip his fly, that may be a lack of creativity, but that's a different problem. That's a different kind of problem. And he knows when to do it and when not to do it. That's also very important. Now, it's the discovery of a universal principle. Now, in the first instance, we think of universal principles as universal physical principles. And one of the paradigms for this is Johannes Kepler's unique discovery of the principle of universal gravitation. And nobody else but Johannes Kepler made it. Yeah? What is this difference? Is that mankind, the human mind, is capable of discovering universal physical principles in the universe which no animal could do. We transmit these discoveries, if we're decent about it, we transmit the reenactment of these same discoveries to other human beings who can reenact this discovery because they too are human. We concentrate on educating our populations so they are prepared to go through the experience of reenacting these kinds of discoveries. To some degree, this is limited to professions, but it spills over from one profession into the population more generally. And this is creativity. Creativity also occurs in a different form. It occurs in the form of classical art, true classical art, not classical because it's ancient or classical because it's habitual, but because it has the same principle in it as the discovery of a universal physical principle such as gravitation. For example, we concentrate in the youth movement on things like the Bach Jesu meine Freude motet, because in order to perform this competently, and that takes some help from people who are masters of it, in order to perform it competently, you have to do something except you don't sing the notes. You have to do something much more. You have to understand how to integrate the performance of the voices in such a way that the intention of Bach comes forth. This means that you cannot simply read a score, note by note. I sing my note, I know my note, I sing my note. Well, a monkey can do that. But this monkeys can't do Bach. They just can't do it. Some try, but they can't. Because in classical art, you have the same thing. You have social processes, social relations, such as polyphony, classical polyphony, singing of it. The same kind of processes which you use for physical scientific discoveries are used now applied to social relations. This includes not only music, as in the Bach tradition, it also includes the natural law, the formation of law, all the other kinds of things we do to impart and share the potentialities of the human mind as unique, as different from the apes, in our social life. Creativity. Let's stick to Kepler, his discovery of gravitation. Now, the usual explanation is nonsense. What Kepler discovered was the basis for the Leibniz calculus. That is that the principle of gravitation, the way it functioned, as Kepler measured this very precisely, is a constant rate of change in motion within the orbit. That is, the elliptical orbit does not determine the motion determines the elliptical orbit. Now what Kepler emphasized is this particular characteristic is a principle of the universe. Now, as others understood after him, such as Einstein in the 1950s when he commented on this thing in some detail, is that the principle of gravitation is universal. It exists as a universal in the universe, as an acting universal. So that the universe is therefore finite, because there is nothing outside the reach of gravitation. There are other principles which, like gravitation, the principle of gravitation, are universal. And to the extent they are determined to be validly universal, we know that they reach as far as the universe does at all times. And the universe is finite in respect to these principles. This man discovers. Now, therefore, these kinds of principles and the discovery by the human mind, something no animal can do, which defines the human being. And a just society, particularly with modern society, with our access to things, a just society does two things. First of all, it demands that every child be brought into this world and developed with the ability, which is natural to them, but the development of the ability to understand and recognize universal principles, both of physical principles and principles of classical artistic composition. In this way, scientific progress is necessary for us not merely because we need it materially to meet human needs. Scientific and classical artistic progress is necessary because we need it for our soul's sake. We need to be human. And we need to be human in the sense that what we discover, that we transfer to people after us when we die, lives on. So that our brief life, our brief mortal life, is a moment in eternity, which lives in eternity. Because our living life participates in the universe for all time. And it's this perception, this understanding of oneself and what it is to be human, which defines a moral society, which is the willingness to die if necessary for one's nation in order to perpetuate these values for future generations of humanity, and also to honor the previous generations which have given us these gifts to share. We require technological progress, scientific progress, not merely to become richer or more powerful, though we need that. We need scientific and technological progress and cultural progress because we need to be immortal, as no animal can be. We need to participate in the discovery and application of universal physical principles and artistic principles that no animal could do. And when we find our motivation and our morality in that, we are morally invincible. And what happened with the baby boomer generation is many of them will pretend to be Christians. I laugh. Go tell God. Because they are not committed to anything right. Look at your gaping audience of stupid creatures, these tweeners. You see these films, these television films, of these masses of tweeners with a couple of old fakers on the platform going through fundamentalism like table hay. So, dupes. They call themselves Christians? They're going to go out, they love Jews so much they're going to go out and kill them? Like Tim LaHaye. Huh? They are Christians? No. This is fakery. But there is something real. There is the reality of the importance of recognizing the nature of the immortality of the individual as distinct from the animals. And that the motive in life is to serve that sense of immortality in an efficient way. And to honor those who have gone before us as immortal for us, as we must commit ourselves to future generations of all humanity. Because there are no human races. There's only one human race. All human beings of whatever background have biologically approximately the same potential for creativity. It's just a question of what happens to them and how they develop, and whether we help them develop or not. So therefore, that should be our motive. Therefore, when you face a situation like this, the threat of war, and we are facing a threat of war worse than anything we could imagine for World War I or II. That's what we face now. We face global asymmetric warfare. We're facing a form of hell which no man knows. But you have the force of evil. And Felix Rohatyn is evil. Some people say you shouldn't call him a Nazi. Well, why not? He is. Well, he doesn't like it. Well, tell him to wash. Huh? Wash himself for a change. Huh? Now, the problem is Felix is really evil. He's not evil in the sense that he stole a tart. Huh? He's evil in the sense that he's made himself immortally, intrinsically evil. Because he's dedicated to the destruction of humanity. And he represents a group of people just exactly like that behind Hitler, exactly the same, which has a conception of they want a planet with less than 1 billion people on it. They want the elimination of the nation state. They want globalization controlled by these financier interests. The same thing that the Hitler movement was for, the same thing the people behind Hitler were for. Return to the Crusades. Remember the history of this thing. You have Charlemagne develops a world order in collaboration with the Islamic culture of the Arab Baghdad Caliphate, in collaboration with Jews who were the mediation, largely in the work between Harun al-Rashid of Baghdad and Charlemagne. These forces moved to destroy what Charlemagne was trying to build. And they took a bunch of gangsters who were called the Norman Chivalry, working for Phoenician usurers, and they set up a system called the Crusades. And they killed everybody. Muslims, Jews, everyone. And destroyed society, destroyed civilization. What Rohatyn represents is a process, a movement, which has continued to exist in the Venetian tradition since that time, which has moved in and is determined to create what's called a globalized world order. a globalized world order in which much of society is destroyed, in which most nation states which presently exist disappear from the planet, which the population is down to, say, 3/4 of a billion people, or less, in a fairly short order, and in which the world is run by syndicates of bankers. Privatized warfare. What happened, for example, the case of Halliburton. What is Halliburton? And Rohatyn and George Shultz and the Cheney crowd, Rumsfeld crowd, are all for this. Destroy the control of the military by governments. Turn military functions over to private armies, like Halliburton. Destroy the regular military. And let private armies controlled by syndicates of financier power run the world by force. We had a proposal like that in the sort of the late part of the mid-1940s. It was called the International Waffen-SS, where the bankers behind the Nazi system were going to replace the Wehrmacht finally and totally with an international SS, the International Waffen-SS, which is what Michael Ledeen represents in his proposals today. This is the kind of thing we're dealing with. This is the enemy of civilization. We must destroy it. Now, what happened? Israel did not start this current war. Yeah, there's a war situation that's going on there in the region of Southwest Asia for a long time. Cheney did, and Bush did. Cheney didn't dream it up. They're the instruments which are used to launch it. The Israeli generals, the Israeli leaders, the senior ones, know this is crap. They know what the Israeli government and others are saying about this situation is crap. The Hezbollah is not going to be puffed away in a short period of time. We're looking at generalized irregular warfare throughout the entire region. There is no solution in Iraq. Iraq will not be solved for a long time to come. The United States has made an unholy mess of Iraq which cannot be repaired for some time to come. Afghanistan, which we went into first, is now far worse, far more menacing than it ever was before. We have the spread of chaos throughout the world, bloody chaos. You're looking at something like the beginning, the onset of a new dark age. And some people wish to bring it on. This is what my Israeli friend said. He said there's no likelihood that anybody would be involved in extending this war, which is being conducted nominally by Israel now, but which is actually Israel is doing under orders from Cheney and company and Bush, not on their own volition. That's why they're shutting up. They're shutting up about the facts. They know the facts. They know the situation is hopeless. They know what apart from all the propaganda, they know what the forces are involved in southern Lebanon. They know the correlation of forces in the Middle East. This is insane. It is absolutely insane for Israel to be involved in that kind of war. It means the destruction of Israel and everything around it in a fairly short order. Why do they do it? They're doing it because they're being pressured to do it. And the pressure comes normally through stupid Bush, who's a psychotic, and Cheney, who's a sociopath. But it's coming from higher levels, typified by the bankers who were associated with Felix Rohatyn. And therefore, we're at a point where the problem we have with the Senate is sophistry. And the sophistry problem is what I've described. It's the baby boomer generation, the golden generation type of sophistry. And therefore, they don't accept reality. They reject reality because they assume that their will, the will, like Hitler, the will, as at a Nuremberg rally, the will, the all-powerful will do everything for us. It is our will that it will happen. That's where it will happen. We will. We have agreed that this will happen. We in the Senate have agreed. We in the House have agreed, except for a few holdouts. Therefore, it will happen because we have agreed. Heil Hitler. What's the difference? The act of the will. Huh? The triumph for will. I believe. I don't care what the truth is. I believe. I don't care what you say. I believe. Like a fundamentalist rally. I believe. They're worshiping Satan. I believe in Christ. Why do you believe in Satan then? Why do you serve Satan? You say, well, I'm all for the Jews. Why? Because we're going to kill them. Tim LaHaye. When we get in power, we're going to give them one chance. You either join, you become a Christian now, or we shoot you, or something else. The most vicious anti-Semites on this planet are called Zionists. Tim LaHaye. Now, this is the problem, is we don't have rationality, and we, who fight for the tradition of the lower 80% of the population, we find ourselves outnumbered by the upper 20%. We produce, well, you just produce. We are the ones who get the pensions. We get the golden parachutes. We are the important people. What do? Oh, we take the money. Oops. That's what you're dealing with. So the problem here essentially is these poor fellows, these baby boomers, because they're sophists, do not believe in the soul. They may thought they sold it for something or other. Went out with the garbage, went out with a bag full of garbage. They don't believe that they have an immortality. They don't believe that they're accountable to past and future generations. They don't believe that their pleasure in what they get physically is not the end of life. Animals get that. You want to become an animal? Okay, become an animal. Take your citizenship card and tear it up. I'm not a citizen anymore. I'm an animal. Turn yourself into the Animal Rescue League. If you're a human being, then you have a moral responsibility which is innate in the fact that you're a human being. And as you say in religion, you are out to save your soul. That's what you do things for. You don't have to be religious in this formal sense of being a member of this or that religion. You have to know that's what's essential. You do it because it's the right thing to do. You risk your life because it's the right thing to do. You take the pain because it's the right thing to do. You take the risk because it's the right thing to do. How the devil do you think we got this far in the United States? How do you think we got through Hitler and got through the other problems we've had? Except by people who took that and who concentrated on trying to inspire and encourage other people to do likewise. It was always a minority of the total population that was the fighting edge of mankind and everything good that happened. But much of the rest of the mankind would follow along and take the benefit and say, hey, this is good. I've got to try to be something like that myself. Huh? So it's inspiring people to understand and find their morality. And I admit it's very difficult to get a baby boomer to accept morality because they have a completely different agenda. But you have a few people like Bill Clinton and others who are worth saving and should be saved and must be saved, in the sense that these people are baby boomers who are face up to the reality of their guilt and do have a higher sense of morality, a commitment to do something for their future while they're still alive, something for the future of mankind while they're still alive, and face the reality of the challenge and the risks we face in doing that. And that's what's lacking. And thus what's happened is you've come to a point, a watershed. We're at a point whereby approximately September, not precisely, forecasting is not predicting. It's not predicting something's going to happen in a mechanical, statistical way. But approximately September, as it stands now, you can expect the whole system to come down the way it's going now. It's finished. And most people in high places around the world who are in this area would tend to agree with me. Yeah, you're right. You're probably right. This we're worried about. We're getting that in Russia. We're getting it in Europe and so forth. They're all these financial circles are saying, look, the system, it can't go on like the system is about to come down. And it'll probably come down around September. Plus or minus, who knows? There can be changes. But that's the war situation. You're up at a point where you must estimate. We have to be prepared for the expectation that the system will come down in September. Maybe it won't, maybe it will. Maybe it'll come down later. If there's a change for the better, it might not come down. I could fix it. I could fix this thing. If I were president of the United States, I could deal with it. This jerk couldn't, of course. Right? But that's where we stand. Therefore, the enemy knows that too. The people behind this stupid jerk, Felix Rohatyn, know it too. They know that approximately that time, they've got to figure the system will come down then. Their issue is they want to get control of the world through chaos by the time the crash occurs. To make sure that no Franklin Roosevelt or his like would intervene as Roosevelt intervened in early March of 1933 to respond to a general crash of the world system with initiatives from the United States, which in fact could save the world from hell. And that's what the issue is. And that's what my Israeli friend's problem was, what he said, is that if the war is coming soon, if the breakdown of the system is coming soon, then what is happening with the United States pushing Israel into a war which the Israeli leaders, at least all the sane ones, know is an insane project, well, then that's almost inevitable. We've got to stop it. We'll only stop it by making clear what the issue is. This is not an Israeli issue. This is an issue of Felix Rohatyn and what he represents, the people behind poor, stupid Bush and Cheney. They're the ones who are pushing this war. They're pushing Israel on a suicide mission for the greater glory of Cheney and Felix Rohatyn. And we've got to stop it. And therefore, we need people in the Congress and elsewhere who have the guts to give up this sophistry of theirs and face the facts about the economy and about the system, and be prepared to join us and do what is necessary. I know what to do to deal with this financial crisis. I know exactly what to do. And that's what I'm prepared to see done. I need their permission to do it.